Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay with these microphones? Oh, I can wear a lapel mic. Is it good at the back? Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So my name is Toby Park. I'm from the Behavioural Insights team, and I head up the energy and sustainability work at the Behavioural Insights team. So I profess to not know an enormous amount about animal welfare, but I do know a few things about human behaviour. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do, give you a few examples of the kind of concepts that we draw upon, and hopefully that'll feel relevant to your own particular sort of behavioural challenges that you're facing. So just to give you a quick intro to the team, so we started life inside 10 Downing Street in 2010, where we then moved into the Cabinet Office and sort of formalised as a team there. But in 2014, we actually span out of the Cabinet Office. We're still a part owned by government, part owned by the innovation charity Nesta, and a part owned by the employees. So that's a slightly convoluted history, but throughout that time, our remit has remained the same, and that is to apply what we call behavioural insights to public policy challenges and social impact objectives. And when I say behavioural insights, what I mean are essentially findings from psychology, so particularly social psychology and cognitive psychology, and behavioural economics. So it's insights into the way that people actually behave, and we try and take these understandings from the academic literature, as well as research we do ourselves, and essentially trying to inject that sort of more sophisticated understanding of people into the way that policy is designed. And that's really done in the recognition that most policy objectives are ultimately about human behaviour in some shape or form. So, you know, whether you're trying to reduce rates of crime or increase educational attainment or encourage recycling or shift the behaviour of the farmers, it's ultimately, more often than not, about human behaviour. And one of the concepts we draw upon quite a lot, which I wanted to mention today, is this idea of a dual process model of cognition. So that's Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman at the bottom. Some of you may have read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which has become a bit of a phenomenon in this field. But the concept is essentially that we have two kind of parallel processes of cognition, what he calls system fast and slow, or system 1 and 2. And the idea is that system 1, or fast, is very much a sort of automatic, intuitive, effortless mode of thought. So if I asked you what's 2 times 2, you would give me an answer without really needing to engage. If you were taking your daily commute, or if you were cooking a meal you've cooked 1,000 times before, you could very much do that on autopilot. And you would sort of be influenced somewhat subconsciously by your environment, but you're sort of doing things quite automatically based on intuition, somewhat emotion, and sort of very rapid sort of thought processes. And then we have system 2, which is the more sort of deliberative, rational mode of thinking. So if I asked you, a complicated sum, you'd have to sit down and think about it. If you were planning a trip somewhere you'd never been before, you'd have to sort of engage and work through the steps. And really the key insight there is that we tend to think of ourselves more as system 2 thinkers. We tend to assume that we're quite deliberative in our decision-making and our choices. But overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests that we're operating much more in system 1, in that sort of fast, automatic mode of thought a lot of the time. And one of the implications of that is that we're very much susceptible to influence beyond our awareness, in particular from the way that our environment is structured and sort of constrains and shapes and influences our behaviours. So in the words of Danny Kahneman, it turns out that the environmental effects on behaviour are a lot stronger than most people expect. So just to give you a sort of trivial example of how that might manifest, if you offer people a choice of 3 sizes of coffee, most people choose the medium. Not everyone, of course, but most people do choose the medium. And you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small for me, the big's a bit too big for me, the medium's the right size. If you then take away the small and add a bigger one, and you offer them the new choice set, they go for the new medium, and you ask them why, and they say, well, the small's a bit too small for me, the big's a bit too big for me, the medium's the right size. And it's kind of amusing, but actually it says something quite profound about the way we think, in that we tend to base our decisions quite strongly off sort of little cues in the context, the way the choices are framed and presented to us, and environmental factors. But we're very good at sort of post-rationalizing a more sort of logical, rational explanation on top of that. So that's a kind of slightly quirky example, and really it's to highlight the point that we have all of these sort of cognitive biases and shortcuts that we tend to draw upon, and really it's a sort of cognitive equivalent of something like a visual illusion, which you're probably quite familiar with. So if you were to look at the 2 squares there labelled A and B, of course we know it's an illusion, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, most of us would say that the square labelled A looks quite a bit darker than the square labelled B. I mean, I've looked at this hundreds of times, and I still find it quite convincing, but in reality they're exactly the same shade of grey. So our mind works in quite unusual, counterintuitive ways that we're often quite unaware of, and it's very useful to understand these kind of mechanisms when you're ultimately trying to influence behaviour through policy and so on. So how can we actually do that? Well, if you think about it, policy levers conventionally are ultimately behavioural tools. So regulation is about influencing behaviour through the force of law, of course. Incentives, about influencing behaviour through imposing some kind of economic sanction or a reward, taxes, subsidies, etc. Information is very much about influencing behaviour by sort of persuading or informing, helping people understand the consequences of their actions. And you've quite possibly heard of, more recently, a fourth approach called nudging. And nudging is really about making these sort of small changes to our choice environment or the choice architecture, things like that coffee cup example, in order to sort of gently influence behaviour without necessarily constraining people's freedom of choice. And that, of course, is very much rooted in behavioural insights and is a part of what we do. But that's not all of what we do. We also should always bear in mind that actually the sort of conventional policy levers can equally be improved through an application of behavioural insights. So, we can make information a bit more persuasive by understanding the way that people actually sort of recall and interpret information. We can make incentives more powerful by understanding the often quite sort of counterintuitive and skewed ways that we perceive, gains and losses and so on. So those are the kind of tools we use. And a number of years ago, we put together a framework which we call the Easte Framework. And this is a really good starting point for people that are relatively new to this kind of way of thinking. So I encourage you to go on our website and download that. But essentially it says if you want to encourage a particular behaviour, a good starting point is to think about how you can make that behaviour as easy as possible, as attractive as possible, as social as possible, and as timely as possible. And we mean a few different things within each of those headings. I would love to go through dozens of examples and explain all of them, but I'm not going to have time for that. So I'm just going to pick out a few examples under easy and social. And obviously, I encourage you to have a look at this document if you can. So, like I said, we mean a few different things by making a behaviour easy. Perhaps the most profound way we can make something easy is to default it. So in other words, what happens by default? What happens if people don't engage or don't make an active choice? What's the sort of default outcome? And I'm sure many of you are aware that a few years ago, the pension system in the UK changed to a system of auto-enrolment. So if you just do nothing, you get a private pension now. Previously, if you did nothing, you didn't get a pension. So the insight here, the choice is still the same. You can still do whatever you want. You have the same kind of meeting with your employer. But if you just don't engage, if you don't make a choice, the default is that you will get one. And this data is a little bit old now, but the sort of first evaluation of this showed that actually it led to pretty significant increases in the number of people saving, both in large and smaller companies. And this is equivalent to billions of pounds spent in subsidies to try and encourage saving behaviour. But of course, it ultimately doesn't really cost anything apart from the sort of implementation costs. And something like 10 million additional savers have emerged from this quite small policy change. So think about what happens automatically. Another way we can make things easier is to try and sort of design out errors and complexities and frictions from processes. So this is a nice study by a guy called Dom King. It's not one of ours, but he redesigned the prescription form that GPs were using with the intention of reducing prescription errors. This is the old form. Of course, doctors have famously bad handwriting. I don't know if that's the same, but there's a lot of scope for error here in terms of, the difference between micrograms and milligrams in bad handwriting can be quite difficult to see. It's quite easy to just miss off certain information and so on. So simply redesigning that form, using more sort of check boxes, enforcing sort of one letter per box, that kind of thing, circling the dosage rather than getting people to write it and so on. Very, very simple change. And what do we see? So this is the situation with the old form. So dose was entered correctly 95% of the time, in other words, a 5% error rate. The prescriber's contact number was hardly ever included, and the frequency of medications was very often incorrectly entered. The new form completely removed the dosage errors and radically improved the other two as well. And Dom King's conclusion from this is that he's a long established surgeon. This has undoubtedly saved more lives than a whole lengthy, illustrious career in surgery. So these small changes can have a big impact that are very worthwhile. We can also think about introducing little frictions if we want to discourage certain behaviours. And I think we all kind of know this intuitively. If you ever try and sign up to some subscription service like Amazon Prime or Netflix or something, they make it incredibly easy to sign up. And then they add in a very small friction to get out of the process. Maybe you've got to send off a letter or you've got to give 30 days notice or whatever it is. And those tiny little frictions, even though they seem quite trivial, can have a disproportionate impact on our propensity to actually complete a behaviour. And actually, but we can use this to more sort of social benefit than simply getting people hooked onto subscription services. So for example, trying to reduce food waste. if you remove the tray from a canteen, but you allow people to go back and have as many seconds as they want, this has been shown to reduce food waste by about 40%, because you're less likely to overfill that tray and take more than you want in the first place. Similarly, we can even save lives by just adding in minor friction. So in 1992 in the UK, the regulations around selling paracetamol changed so that instead of getting them in the little pill pots, they came in these blister packs, and you could only buy a certain amount from a single purchase. And that led to significant reductions in suicides and attempted suicides from paracetamol. So again, these small little frictions and changes can have quite profound impacts. Okay, let's move on to social. I'll give you a few other examples. So when we say social, again, we mean a number of things, but the key insight is that we're very much motivated by sort of social incentives, i.e. a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of a group, a sense of reciprocating favours done to us, and so on. So one of the nice ways we can use that is to simply tell people what most people are doing, highlighting and advertising the positive, good, sort of normal behaviour. And this is particularly useful in instances of compliance and sort of moral behaviour. So if you think about animal welfare, I don't know whether this is the major problem, but if it's common that certain members of the farming community might be sort of cutting corners, and that I would expect to be quite common. We do tend to cut corners when we can. It can be quite helpful just to advertise and reinforce the belief that actually most people are complying with this desired behaviour. So we use this with HMRC to bring forward tax payments. So this is a standard HMRC letter that goes out to late taxpayers, and all we did is we added one sentence, which is 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. And we tried a few variations of that sentence. So we compared a few different conditions. So the control version here is just the standard letter. The UK norm is 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. The local norm is 9 out of 10 people in your area pay their tax on time. The debt norm is 9 out of 10 people with a tax debt like yours pay it on time. And the local and debt is a combination, 9 out of 10 people in your area with a tax debt like yours pay it on time. And what we find is that the standard letter, about 33.6% of people responded and paid within the 23-day window. And that increased across the board. And this is a huge sample, so these are all statistically significant. And, you know, obviously from the worst to the best, you got roughly a 20% in proportional terms increase. And that was enough to bring forward a couple of $100 million in tax revenue, just by changing one sentence on a letter, which of course is completely costless because the letter's being sent out anyway. So understanding these quite small, subtle kind of drivers of our behaviour can have quite profound impacts, and often very cost-effective impacts as well. But we've got to be careful with social norms because it's quite common to see things like this. Only 5% of people wash their hands correctly. That is well-intentioned, and who knows, maybe it's effective through a different mechanism. In other words, it's sort of making you feel a bit disgusted and encouraging you to not be one of the disgusting, unclean people. But that is essentially saying 95% of people don't wash their hands. So it's a normal behaviour. And we've just seen that advertising norms encourages them. So, you know, be careful with that sort of thing. I think it's a very common mistake that we try and advertise the bad behaviour as a way of sort of highlighting the gravitas of the situation, but that can very much backfire. Another couple of ways, actually, we can use these sort of social incentives to encourage behaviour. We did a trial with an investment bank trying to encourage employees to donate money to charity. And the idea was that rather than donating cash, let's sort of frame it as if you're donating a day of your time. So actually it was, well, why don't you donate 1 day's salary? Just pretend you're doing 1 day of work for this charity. That was the sort of nature of the campaign. But we wanted to test a few different ways of asking for that money to see if there was a differential impact in the way that we ask it. So we tried 5 different ways. So the control group here was just a sort of generic email from the HR department of the organisation, just asking if people would be interested in donating a day's salary to charity. The celebrity condition was a couple of minor celebrities asking. This was a Olympic rugby player and a local radio DJ, so not A-list, but you know, a slightly more sort of known personality, but a pizzazz about it. The sweets was what we call a reciprocity intervention. The reciprocity simply means that we're very much innately predisposed to reciprocate favours that are done to us. If somebody does something to you, it's quite hard to resist sort of at least returning something in kind. So this was a sort of 50p little packet of sweets that were given unconditionally before asking people if they would like to donate to charity. The personal email was a request from the CEO of the company, and the sweets plus personal was with the sweets plus the personal email from the CEO. So with the control group, 5% of employees donated. That's already reasonably high. It's a bit higher than sort of national averages in this sort of situation. The celebrity went up to 7%. Sweets more than doubled, up to 11%. And bear in mind, this is a 50 pence pack of sweets, and the donations were in the several hundreds up to thousands of pounds. These are investment bankers earning quite a lot of money. Personal email went up to 12%, and that highlights the power of what we call the messenger effect. So the person giving you the information or making the request or providing the message, the identity of that person is often as important or more important than the content of the message itself. And I think actually that's something which is quite profoundly relevant to this room, because our limited research we've done with DEFRA in the sort of biosecurity and welfare space, vets tend to be overwhelmingly seen as a sort of trusted, credible messenger in this industry, perhaps more so than some other stakeholders. And then combining the two jumps up to 17%. So we more than tripled the number of donations just by choosing the right person to make the ask and by giving very cheap little packets of sweets. And finally, one last example, sort of bringing together some of these ideas in the context of antimicrobial resistance. So this is a trial we did on human prescriptions of antibiotics. And this was, again, a letter trial. So we were making some alterations to the communications that were being sent out from the Department of Health. And we did 4 things. So this integrates some of the things we've been thinking about from easy and social, but also from attractive and timely, which I haven't covered. But we tried to make it as easy as possible by very much simplifying the letter, including 3 clear, actionable steps that GPs could take to reduce their antibiotic prescription rates. It was attractive in that we've got that sort of recognized messenger, a trusted, credible messenger, in this case, the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davies. It was also social. We used a kind of version of a social norm here, so we tailored this to each region, and we targeted only the 20% of highest prescribing GPs, such that we could legitimately say the great majority, 80% of practices in your area, prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. And the reason we tailored it per area is because we didn't want GPs to sort of easily reach a sort of excuse that, my population, my patient population is different to others, blah, blah, blah. And it was timely in the sense that one common issue that GPs face is that patients come in, they expect something. They don't want to go away empty-handed, and so GPs feel sort of pressured into giving them something, and a prescription for antibiotics is quite an easy recourse. So we gave leaflets that would allow GPs to prescribe sort of self-care, and also delay prescription, so that the prescription could be given, but it would be dated 3 days in advance, and then ultimately, of course, many people feel that they don't actually need it after that time frame. What do we see? So again, we ran another randomized control trial, have a sample of about 1,600 GPs, comparing the sort of baseline receive nothing versus this letter, and we find a consistent and lasting just over 3% reduction in antibiotic prescriptions. And all the letters were sent out in October, so it's quite interesting to see that actually the effect sustains over the course of about 6 months. So again, it's a nice example of quite a cheap, quite a simple intervention. It's not going to save the planet, but actually that is quite a significant impact in the scheme of this particular policy challenge. Sending the letters out cost about £20,000, and at the time the NHS had just put up £150 million to try and reduce the UK's prescription rate by 4%. We've achieved just over 3% among the 20% of highest prescribers, which would equate to almost 1% if rolled out across the country. So again, small changes, understanding the way that people are influenced by their sort of social connections and so on, can be quite profound. So I'm going to leave it there. So thanks so much for your attention. I encourage you to have a look at the Easte Framework. There's the website there, behaviourinsights.co.uk. And thank you for your attention. And yes, any questions?
Perfect timing, Toby. Okay, we'll go straight into a couple of questions. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Does knowing how the Easte Framework works mean that people are more immune to the impact of it?
Interesting. So there haven't been a huge number of studies on this, but the studies that do exist suggest that knowing you're about to get nudged doesn't seem to make much difference. But of course, it does really depend on the nudge. Often people like being nudged. You like auto-enrollment, for example, makes the process of saving a lot easier. You're still very free to opt out if you want to. But actually, a lot of us can't be bothered with the hassle of proactively setting up a pension. So things like that, I would say, doesn't make a difference. That said, I suspect there will be instances where we develop a bit of resistance against this because it's just getting overused and getting frustrating. So I'm sure many of you are aware, in these days, if you try and book a flight or a hotel room, it's very often to see little alerts saying, only 2 rooms left at this price, or 16 people in the last hour have booked this. And of course, those are nudges. There's sort of harnessing scarcity effects and telling you that things are running out, or telling you that it's popular, and that has a sort of social norm effect. And I think that can, frankly, get a little bit annoying, so quite possibly. But, it's a tool, and like any other tool, you have to sort of use it wisely and sparingly. We've only done a couple of studies where we've nudged the population to, in this case, pay their taxes in a Latin American context, and then nudged the same people the year after. And actually, it had an even stronger effect on them, which is quite interesting. Suggesting there's some kind of consistency effect. If you pay your tax one year, maybe you're more likely to pay it the next year as well. So it's a complicated question, but on aggregate, it seems like that's not too much of an issue so far, based on the available evidence.
The next question is an absolute cracker.
Oh dear.
Do 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time? In other words, is it okay to lie to manipulate behaviour?
Well, obviously, it's not okay. I guess a more nuanced question might be, would it be effective? So in that case, it is true. We're obviously very strict in we're good civil servants. We only use true statistics. Of course, with PAYE, vastly more than 9 out of 10 people actually pay their tax on time. But as to whether it be effective, difficult to say. The thing is, it has to be very believable. What you're essentially doing is trying to update people's prior beliefs in the appropriate direction, because particularly with instances of compliance, like tax payment, we tend to be very good at rationalising our non-compliance, partly by sort of making excuses that, everyone else is doing it. Nobody pays their tax on time, it's fine. So you're updating that belief and demonstrating that actually the vast majority of people are doing the right thing. But if it's completely unbelievable, I suspect it won't work. It does depend on believability. And an easy way to do that is just to be honest, and that's what we would do anyway. So.
I'm going to take one final question here, and it's from one of our policy staff at BVA. Apologies for raising Brexit. How polite. How should we design schemes to incentivise farmers towards better animal welfare with the pot of money that has been tied to CAP? And I appreciate that you're not from a livestock background, but have you any thoughts on how we can incentivise farmers?
So, again, really complicated issue, and I know there's a lot of thinking being done about this. I certainly think that CAP reform is fundamentally a good idea. As I said, the little research I've done, having spoken to some vets on this a year or so ago, it seems like there is a genuine risk that CAP would undermine productivity benefits in the sense that it undermines the motivation to improve your productivity. In terms of animal welfare, there's a lot of money there, so a lot could be done. It seems like at the moment DEFRA's talking mostly around promoting sort of stewardship of the land and that sort of thing with this money, but I don't see why it couldn't also be used to incentivise good behaviours. But we have to be careful here, because actually behaviours that are construed as sort of morally good and ought to be done anyway, there is a risk that payments can undermine those behaviours, what we call crowding out of incentives, where the sort of extrinsic financial incentive can actually crowd out the intrinsic incentive to do the right thing. It's very difficult to predict whether or not that will happen, because there are other occasions where it can actually strengthen, but it does sometimes happen. So, for example, if you start paying people to do work that they're otherwise volunteering to do, often that backfires, because a large part of the value people have for doing the right thing is the feeling of doing the right thing and sort of signalling that fact to people. And so payments can actually backfire on that. So I think we need to be a bit careful before we start paying farmers to look after their animals, because it also sort of licenses the bad behaviour, because it sort of gives the message that, well, if I'm happy to forgo the money, then it's okay to not do this thing. So there's a lot of interesting behavioural insights in the way that incentives should be structured. Just to give you one other nice example, lotteries are a really nice use of limited funds, because we tend to focus more on the size of the prize and somewhat overestimate small probabilities. So let's say you've got a pot of £1,000 and you've got 1,000 people you want to influence. Actually giving them all a 1 in 1,000 chance of winning the whole pot is often more effective than giving them all £1 each, if you see what I mean, on the same sort of total cost. So there are sort of interesting creative ways, and we're sort of thinking about that at the moment with regards to the proposed plastic bottle deposit return scheme, for example, a bit of a different context. But imagine if you pay your 20 pence on a deposit on a plastic bottle, then you take it back, but rather than just getting that 10 pence back, maybe you get, rather than getting 20 pence back, maybe you get 10 pence back, and the other 10 pence automatically enters you into a lottery, and every 20,000th bottle won 20 grand or whatever, or 5 grand. Those kind of things can be quite appealing relative to sort of lump sums. So, slightly convoluted answer, but there are many, many ways in which incentives can be boosted or reframed, harnessing the way that we think about losses, gains, probabilities, and so on, that can be quite interesting.
Excellent. Can you join me again in just thanking Toby for his presentation? Thank you.